Hello and welcome to Tech Deals. Building a new PC can be an enjoyable, rewarding experience. It can also be a frustrating, difficult experience if you are new to PC building or you haven't done it in a while. If you are looking to build a new PC and you want a deep dive into the parts selection with a discussion on why to pick or not pick certain parts and the pros and cons of different choices, then you have come to the right place. Gosh, that seems like a lot. Do I really need to watch all of that? Maybe not. We have a shorter version of this video linked in the video description below for people who are more familiar with current products in PC building. This PC is primarily focused on gaming. It will also handle content creation, business work, multitasking, and more. However, that is not the focus here. The goal is to build a PC that will provide 4 years of gaming performance at 1440p for a reasonable price. This is the second video in a series on this build. You will find the playlist linked in the video description below that will be added to over time as we do further content on this PC build. Without further ado, please grab a drink, grab a snack, and let's get into it. Buy Windows 10 Professional for $15, activate instantly online with Microsoft, and keep it forever. Don't pay full price. Get the best deal from our sponsor, URCD Keys, using our link in the video description below. Full details on how this amazing deal works at the end of the video. Today's video is not scripted. Usually they are, which helps to condense a lot of information into a fairly short, for me that is, video. Instead, expect my raw thoughts on each part as I share my take on the current options for a mid-range gaming build. Everything in this build will be linked in the video description below. Those are affiliate links. Using those links while shopping is a great way to proactively support your favorite content creator. Our links will take you to our own dedicated store selection page, and there you can pick from Amazon, Newegg, B&H, Best Buy, and more. If one store is sold out, check another. Please note that Intel sponsored part 1 of this video series. However, they are not sponsoring this one. Now, they will be sponsoring 2 other videos later in this series, but this one has to be all me, because I do have some nice things to say about AMD, and you can imagine how well that conversation would go. Our original $2,000 build featured Intel's i5-13600K 14-core 20-thread CPU. That is an absolute beast for just over $300. Many people would compare that CPU in terms of price and overall performance to AMD's Ryzen 7 7700X, or perhaps one of the older i9s, the i9-10900K. Similar price points, almost kind of sort of similar performance, but not quite. The truth of the matter is the i5-13600K is faster than the older 10th gen i9-10900K in all respects. Single core, multi-core makes no difference. The new i5 is faster. It is also faster than the Ryzen 7 7700X in most respects. However, single-threaded performance, sometimes the Ryzen 7 will win, sometimes the i5 will win. In multi-threaded performance, the i5 generally wins in everything. And with the new AMD discounts, they both cost about the same, except for motherboards and RAM, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. One question many of you may have is, if you're going to buy the i5, why not buy the i7-13700K for about $100 more? Well, if you've got the $100, by all means do so. The actual differences between the chips are not large. 6 performance cores versus 8 performance cores. They both have the same number of efficiency cores. However, the TDP, which of course can be adjusted on a Z board, but the TDP is higher out of the box, the clock speeds are higher out of the box, and it will last a bit longer. However, if you are not happy with 14 cores, might I suggest you might want to leapfrog the i7 and go straight to the i9. It is telling that when Intel sent us the launch samples, they only sent us the i5 and the i9. You go budget or you go big. You go in the middle and you spend more money, but you don't really get the best, and you still have compromises to live with. And yes, the i9 does cost more, but I have a thought for you. This is the last of the CPUs that will fit onto LGA 1700. New motherboards will be coming out, one of the reasons why people like AMD. Historically, and this goes true back more than 10 years, the top Intel CPU on any given platform, the i9-9900K, which was the best of the 300 series boards, the i7-7700K, which was the best of the 1 and the 200 series boards, and so on, holds its value better than the mid-range chips. You will pay more for the i9, but if you sell your CPUs or simply want to use it for a long time to come in a secondary machine, it will last longer in terms of both money and performance than the lower-end chips. So you pay about $200 more for it versus the i7, but you get that back later, and you get a CPU that will last 4 to 5 years in your primary machine and possibly another 4 to 5 years in a secondary machine. Having said that, discussions of i9s really do sort of leave the mid-range build. All I'll say is this: if you're willing to spend the money on an i9-13900K, I would strongly encourage you to consider a Ryzen 9 7950X. 16 cores versus 24, but they're all 16 performance cores, 8 performance versus 16 efficiency. I've done videos on this, it's an interesting mix, but if you've got that kind of money, look at this as well, because then the DDR5 and higher price motherboards aren't as big a deal. The problem with the lower end Ryzen chips is the DDR5 RAM and the motherboards cost more than the Intel options. Overall, the i5-13600K is the best bang for the buck of all the CPUs here. One more thing about CPUs. This discussion is for brand new builds where you're buying everything, motherboard, RAM, etc. If you are upgrading, then the situation changes. If any of you out there have a AM4 platform, a X370, X470 motherboard, a B550 motherboard, and you've got a Ryzen 7 2700X, a Ryzen 5 3600, run, don't walk, and go buy a Ryzen 9 5900X or a Ryzen 7 5700X and drop it into your current board. Moving on to motherboard selections, there are about 18,500 motherboards to pick from. Well, maybe not that many, but it sure feels like it at times. Some of these manufacturers legitimately make more than 40 different motherboards on a single platform, which is utterly ridiculous. But that's a topic for another video. So let's talk about the Intel side of the table. Don't bother with a B board. The money savings isn't worth the fuss. You can spend about $120 to $130 at the time of filming for a decently equipped B660, which is one number higher than this, but let's not go there either, a B660 motherboard for Intel, and you lose a lot of features in the process. The boards generally tend to have fewer USB ports, fewer expansion slots, fewer M.2 slots, a little bit less power delivery. The audio and the LAN options are usually downgraded. Not by a lot, but you sort of take a little bit off the board to save that money. They didn't save $50 magically. You can buy a Z690 motherboard for about $170. Several different manufacturers make them. ASUS has a very nice Z690 Prime board. It's the Prime-P for $170, at least as of filming this video. Fairly basic board, but better than most of the B boards. However, the sweet spot is at $250, which sounds like a lot of money to anybody who hasn't built a computer in 5 years. I hear you. It used to be $150 was the sweet spot. Those days, I'm sorry, are over. Yes, the B boards tend to cost that much these days. This Aero board uses DDR4 RAM, and for anything other than an i9-13900K, use DDR4. The differences are meaningless. You want to use something like this master board, which uses DDR5 if you're using the i9-13900K. Here's the shortest TLDR ever. DDR5 makes a substantial and noticeable difference over DDR4 if you're using an RTX 4090 at 1440p. If you are using an RTX 3090 at 1440p, the difference is less than 2% between DDR4 and DDR5. If you plan to upgrade later, maybe it's worth it, but if you plan to upgrade to a 4090 in the future, don't buy an i5, buy the i9, because if you've got $1,600 video card money, why are you buying $300 CPUs? We'll talk about that more in the graphics card section. This is a really nice board. It's about $250. It comes with exceptionally good features, amazing power delivery, quad M.2 slots. It's got more USB ports than you can shake a stick at. It's a really, really nice board. You don't need what you get up here in the $350 to $400 range unless you're just building a super premium $4,000+ PC and you just want the best of the best. This is sort of where the sweet spot ends. Now, as far as AMD goes, you absolutely do not need an X670 board. The B650s are fine, but you do get some more features there. And again, Ryzen 5, Ryzen 7. But as you move up to the 7950X, I'd actually step up above the Steel Legend, to be completely honest, and maybe get the Tai Chi. It's a $500 board, which is outrageous. But if you've got $600 CPU money and you're buying a $1,600 video card, in for a penny, in for a pound. Overall, the deal is at the $250 price point. Now it's time to talk about system RAM, and I've used at least one or two kits in my life. One important thing I think is worth considering when discussing system memory is experience versus benchmarks. You will find many people will say that 16 gigabytes is all that you need for gaming because they run a completely clean test bench, they load up one game, nothing's running in the background, everything's turned off, they look at the system memory usage, it is less than 16 gigabytes on a fresh reboot of the machine, and they will proudly proclaim, all you need is 16 gigabytes to game. Well, sure, and if you use your computer like that, I guess that's a true statement. But since I'm willing to bet you don't, can we please take 16 gigabytes and put that aside? If you're building a new machine in 2022 or 2023, at a minimum, it should have 32 gigabytes of RAM. And especially if you're watching a YouTube video about building PCs, it should have at least 32 gigabytes of RAM. The real question is, should you have 32? Or 64. Now, we're not going to discuss 128, that's professional level machines, that's i9s, Ryzen 9s, that's people who make money with their computer, and there's a place for it. I have a machine with 128 gigs, I make 4K YouTube videos, it makes sense. But for most of you, the choice is 32 versus 64. In actual use, in terms of using a machine with Chrome tabs open, maybe a second monitor, you load up a game, you've got 3 or 4 launchers in the background, maybe your OneDrive and G Drive are syncing, Windows updates are running, antivirus scans are running and updating in the background. Yes, you can get by with 32 gigabytes today, but maybe not tomorrow. 32 gigabytes will work for most people today. You do not need 64 gigabytes to have a nice experience and to have a nice computer. However, we're trying to build a machine that will last 4 years. Now, one thing people will say is, well, why don't I build a machine with 32 gigabytes today and I will upgrade to 64 gigabytes tomorrow? Fair enough. Let's talk about that. With DDR5, there's some logic to be said there. You can spend up to $200 buying 32 gigabytes of DDR5 RAM, really nice RAM, RGB, premium, Trident ZRGB5, etc. But if you're buying DDR4, which you should be if you're buying an i5-13600K, the price difference is a nice dinner. We're talking about $80 versus $160 to go from 32 gigabytes to 64 gigabytes. I would make the argument that if you're building a DDR4 system today, the $80 difference is not worth the savings. It is not going to be substantially cheaper in the future by enough to bother. And when you buy more RAM in the future, you're now mixing RAM kits that were made at different times, which might or might not work together, and they might or might not cause you any issues. When you buy all your RAM at once, you can be assured from day one everything runs the way it should. If you can afford it and you decide to go the DDR5 route, for example, you're buying an i9-13900K, then I would argue you should go with 64 gigabytes of RAM. If you're building a 24-core machine in 2022 or maybe 2023 when you're watching this, the DDR5 cost of 64 gigabytes, while not cheap at $350 to $400, means you don't have to think about RAM again. This is about ease of use. This is about the next 4 years of not having to care. Load your programs, load your games, load everything that you want, and then you just don't have to think about it. New game coming out, I've got existing stuff running. Oh, I've got to close programs. I've got to shut things down. Are my services all clean? Do you really want to care for a relatively small percentage of the price of your machine versus going, I'm done with RAM. I've got enough that I never have to think about it. Those of you who have watched me regularly know I'm a strong proponent of having more than the minimum amount of RAM. Why in the world people want to argue for enough versus plenty is beyond me, especially at these prices. DDR5 I understand, but at DDR4 there's no excuse. For $160 you can make all that go away. Now as far as RAM speed goes, I did a dedicated video on that. I did 3200 versus 3600, CL16 versus CL18. I used 3 different RAM kits, and drum roll please, The difference was basically nothing. You can find a difference in RAM speed if you hunt for it. Many of you may have seen benchmarks from other YouTubers and on other websites that say, oh, look, if you get low latency RAM and you overclock it and you tweak the timings, you can get an extra 10% frames per second. Yes, you can, if you're using an RTX 3090 Ti at 1080p low detail. Raise your hand if you plan to play at 1080p low detail with an RTX 3090 Ti, because if you don't, none of those benchmarks mean anything. With an RTX 3070 or 3070 Ti, with a RX 6800 XT at 1440p high detail, there is basically zero difference between 3200, 3600, or 4000 in DDR4. DDR5, about the same thing. The only place where you really start to notice it is when you go really extreme in terms of graphics card performance. An RTX 4090 at 1440p will start to show a difference in RAM speed. But if you've got $1,600 to buy a video card, okay, fine. Yes, absolutely. Buy premium RAM with low cache latency. It'll cost a little bit more, but you're building essentially an unlimited supercomputer at that point, not a mid-range build, which is what this video is all about. You cannot build a modern computer without a solid-state drive. Well, you can, but you're not going to, so we'll just say that you have to. I have used, with a couple of exceptions of drives that are still in the package, every SSD you see on the desk. Most of them for the YouTube channel, but not all. Some of these predate the YouTube channel. Some of these were used for unrelated tasks for builds and some of the things that I did over the past 6 years, but a majority of the drives you see on the desk were used for the channel. Now, I do not have every SSD here. Some of these are 120 and 240 gig drives from 2016. They're kind of useless in 2022, but I still have all the boxes, and it sort of illustrates the depth and breadth of experience you get when you test a lot of these things over the years. I have also been doing a lot more storage much longer than YouTube. I started my first computer network business in 1996. I have been doing this professionally for a living for 30 years. IDE was new when I started in the computer business, so it's been a while. Not that that experience has any relevance to today, but it's a depth and breadth of experience that comes from having dealt with this stuff for a very long time. I cannot possibly cover everything there is to know about storage in a roundup video like this. It really does deserve its own video, and even that would be long if I covered everything. So let me give you the TLDR version. If you're building a $1,500 to $2,000 machine in 2022 or beyond, your boot drive should be 2 terabytes. Please take it from somebody who has done this since 2 megabytes was a decent amount of storage on a 3.5-inch floppy drive. I said megabytes, not gigabytes. It's important. Although I did buy a 1 gigabyte hard drive in 1993 that cost an absolute fortune. It was a Fast SCSI 2 hard drive, for those of you curious. Man, they were expensive back then. 4060X266. Those were the premium days. So take it from somebody who's done this for a long time. If you are building a new machine in 2022 and you're in the $1,500 plus price point, 2 terabytes should be your boot drive. Some of you will disagree with me. All of you are probably wrong. And the reason I say that is because I'm looking forward 4 years. I'm thinking about the size of Windows growing. I'm thinking of the size of programs growing. Forget your games for a minute. You may put the majority of your games on a game drive, but you might put 1 or 2 on your boot drive as well. You also never want to fill an SSD more than about 80% full because their performance and their life actually get reduced when you try to fill them up too much. Interesting quirk of SSDs versus hard drives. TLC versus QLC. Your boot drive should be a TLC drive. I don't care if you're building a $650 ultra budget machine, it should be a TLC drive. QLC is fine for game drives, it's fine for bulk storage, it's fine for secondary or tertiary drives. Your boot drive should be a TLC drive. All of your SSDs should have DRAM buffers. Yes, it's true, I put a DRAM-less SSD as the game drive in the $2,000 build in part 1 of this series. I was trying to hit that $2,000 price point, and I did. Some people objected, saying, you can't build this for $2,000. It was actually $1,998 on the day I put the build together when I wrote the script. Prices change every day. Of course, it's going to be different from one day to the next. In 10 years, that computer will be $50 on Craigslist, but that's a separate conversation. Your boot drive should at least have a DRAM buffer. Your tertiary drives ideally have DRAM buffers, but if they don't, if you're trying to save some money, if you want to go large, I absolutely understand. I have a couple of DRAM-less SSDs as well. I do notice the difference on large game updates, but they can happen in the background. It is not, in fact, the end of the world. You don't want Windows on that. As far as Gen 3 versus Gen 4, it makes shockingly little difference. Random performance matters way more than sequential, and none of the SSDs can saturate Gen 3 in random performance, not even with high queue depths. Really, Gen 4 is for upcoming direct storage and burst transfer modes, and the price gap has now dropped by enough. Yes, your boot drive might as well be a Gen 4 at this point. It is not a huge price difference. You're looking at maybe $150 for a Samsung 970 EVO 2TB drive versus $200 for a Samsung 980 Pro 2TB boot drive. Gen 3, Gen 4, the 980 Pro is faster, it's a newer drive. It doesn't make a huge difference in the grand scheme of things, but again, if you're building a $1,500 to $2,000 machine, ultimately in the long run, you'll be happy with the Gen 4 drive. SATA drives are still fine, especially if you don't have more M.2 slots. So if you build a new machine, you should have at least 3, if not 4, M.2 slots. And the price difference between SATA and NVMe is pretty minor. But there's absolutely nothing wrong with using a SATA drive for a second or third or fourth SSD if you need to. The other big consideration is brand, and this is where a deep dive is desperately needed because there are real differences between drives even if the specs look the same. I have used a lot of different brands over the years, and over the past couple of years especially, I have noticed an interesting trend. It has become easier to make the specs look amazing while providing a subpar drive. Samsung 980 Pros, Western Digital SN850Xs, and there's a few others out there, are really sort of the premium drives. When you start moving down from that list, you start removing capabilities and features that you don't notice. What do you see advertised on the drive? You see the sequential transfer rate in terms of read and write speed under absolutely ideal, perfect conditions. You see that it's got a nice drive write life rating. You see that it's got modern Gen 4 performance characteristics. But what you don't see, unless you really dig into them, is how large is the SLC cache? All modern drives, TLC, QLC, everything, they all use SLC caches because the actual native transfer rate of the NAND that's actually on the drive is not that great. So they all use SLC caches. Do they use a DRAM buffer? How large is the DRAM buffer? I have noticed some drives starting to cheap out. You will find 2 and 4 terabyte drives with only a 1 gigabyte DRAM buffer. Your drive should have 1 gigabyte of DRAM for every terabyte of storage. And you really get into a penalty with a lot of data on the drive once you fill that up. You don't see it in a lot of reviews because a lot of reviewers don't fill the drives. You have to fill the drive before you really start to feel that pain. All of that theory is great, but you probably want some specific drive recommendations. The long and short of it is you get what you pay for. Buy a Samsung 980 Pro or a Western Digital SN850X if you can afford it, and basically your problems go away. Those are the super premium options. But there are several other options that are really, really close. Lately, I've been buying a bunch of these Inland Professional Plus drives. They are very, very similar to the Samsung and the Western Digital. They're actually made by Micro Center, believe it or not, of all places, and the warranty is actually provided directly by Micro Center. However, they are not equipped with the same exact features, and they don't come with a nice SSD toolbox software you can load in your tray. And how many of you ever heard of Inland Professional Plus? If they are less expensive, it's worth doing. If the price is really similar, do yourself a favor, buy a Samsung or a Western Digital. When you look at all of the boxes on the desk, you will see a lot of different brands. I used to recommend a lot more brands. There really isn't a reason to anymore because the prices have now compressed. Yes, you can save $20. Yes, you can save $30. But in the scope of a $2,000 build that you're going to keep for 4 years, do you want a maybe good enough drive that holds all your data and actually controls the speed at which everything loads, launches, boots, and updates? Or do you just want to go straight to the top of the list and buy the best? For $200, you can buy either the Western Digital or the Samsung Premium Drive in the 2 terabyte size. And if you absolutely disagree with me on the size, you can buy both of them in the one for about $100 in the 1 terabyte size if that's what you prefer. And at those prices, why buy anything else? No gaming PC would be complete without a graphics card. Now, some of you objected to the inclusion of the RTX 3070 in the first part of this video series, and while I understand the objections, my counterpoint would be it's MSRP and it is a really, really good card with great features on it. Yes, the 6700 XT is less expensive in terms of a dollar cost per frame per second. Absolutely 100% without any doubt whatsoever, buy a 6700 XT, about $350 versus $500. However, you can find these used for $350 if the price bothers you and you want NVIDIA features. If you go up and down the food chain, you will find NVIDIA costs more across the board than AMD does. Look at the new 40 series versus the 7000. You're paying $1,200 to $1,600 for NVIDIA versus $900 to $1,000 for AMD. For better or worse, NVIDIA just costs more. But NVIDIA does provide NVENC video encoding and decoding. It does provide, yes, I know the new 7000 series has some good features there, but let's be honest. If you're a professional creator, NVENC is where it's at. Ray tracing, tensor cores, CUDA support, Adobe Premiere support. I mean, if you're editing videos in Adobe Premiere the way we are, you have an NVIDIA card. And if you don't, you did it wrong. However, for people who just want to play games and don't really care too much about ray tracing, yes, absolutely. For value, AMD is where it's at. Now, $350 will buy you a 6700 XT with 12 gigabytes of VRAM and very good 1440p performance. One thing that I did not talk about as much as I should have in part one, oversight on my part, I apologize, is that the video card included at that budget is meant to provide 1440p gaming in current games and games for the next year or two for the foreseeable future. But when I said it's a 4-year PC, in my mind, I'm expecting you're going to need a video card upgrade in 2 years. Think the 8000 series if you want to skip the 7000 from AMD, or the 50 series from NVIDIA. So you could skip the upcoming 4070, but if you buy a 3070, you are going to need a 5070. 4 years from now is 2026. An RTX 3070 or an RX 6700 XT is not going to be a great 1440p gaming card in 2026. That detail should have been maybe hammered home a little bit more in part one, so for that, I apologize. If you would like to potentially get 4 years of 1440p gaming performance without needing a GPU upgrade, well, then you need to take a step up. You can go with an RTX 3080 or 3080 Ti, or if you can find a good deal on a used one, a 3090 can actually be had for about $750 these days with 24 gigs of VRAM. It's worth looking at. Or for about $600, you can look at an RX 6800 or 6900 XT. Depending upon where you live, the prices fluctuate. They were a little bit better around Black Friday, but they're still pretty competitive. Performance-wise, a 6800 XT and an RTX 3080 are very, very competitive, but the RTX 3080s brand new do cost $100 to $200 more. Again, the NVIDIA tax. While it's a great idea to consider buying a little bit more video card to have 4 years of gaming performance, I want to point something out. All of these cards are already 2 years old. Some of them are a little over 2 years old. If you're looking for something that lasts 4 years from today, what you're really saying is, I want to buy a video card that's going to provide 1440p gaming for 6 years, not 4, because you're buying a card that already exists. It does not fit within the $2,000 budget. However, if you can stretch your budget and buy an RTX 4080 or the new RX 7900 XTX for $1,000, which just launched and beats the 4080 in some games, loses in others, they're very close overall, then you will get something substantially faster than any of these cards. But it does not fit within that $2,000 budget. There is one very important point that I want to make about graphics cards that applies almost more than anything else you can put in your computer. You almost cannot overbuy a graphics card. Yeah, you can if you want to play very basic games. But in general, if you're watching a video like this, you cannot overbuy your graphics card. Even if you go out and spend $1,600 on an RTX 4090, and you go, well, I just want to play at 1440p high detail, that's a waste of money. It is today. Absolutely. That is a waste of money today. But 4 years from now, you will still have a premium experience. Quick rewind. In 2017, NVIDIA launched the GTX 1080 Ti. The 1080 Ti is still a viable graphics card today. Not really at 1440p. It really has kind of left the 1440p space at this point. Don't look at Shadow of the Tomb Raider benchmark. Shadow of the Tomb Raider is 4 years old. New current games, it's a 1080p card. But it was a 1440p card for a very long time. If you had ponied up the $1,200 that you typically would have had to spend 4 years ago for an RTX 2080 Ti, you absolutely have a 1440p graphics card today, and you will for a couple more years to come. I would argue that the RTX 2080 Ti, as expensive as it was for $1,200 4 years ago, is a 6-year 1440p card. It's basically the performance of the 3070, and that absolutely has 2 more years of 1440p in it, with only a couple of maybe, you won't be able to run ultra max detail and everything, but it has 1440p high in it in basically every game that'll come out in the next 2 years. If you spend $1,200 to $1,600 on a card, you may have a 6-year card where you don't have to care. Run everything in ultra today, and only 3 or 4 years from now, we have to start turning it down to high detail to keep acceptable performance. So if you spend more, you just buy the future, which is kind of cool if you think about it. Just as important as anything else you put in your computer, you need a case. You get what you pay for. $50 cases suck. $100 cases are really nice. $150 cases are very premium. That is the long and short of it. This is a Cooler Master H500 ARGB case. It is currently $99. It is an excellent value for the money. 2 200mm fans up front, handle, ports, everything. I own 2 of these. I have built in this case. It is wonderful for that price. But if you want to step up, Corsair's 5000D Airflow case with the mesh in the front for about $150 is a step up. It does have some features that are nicer, but it costs more. The $50 cases, yes, you can absolutely buy a case for $50. You can buy a case for $75, and it's your computer. You can do whatever you want. I've built in too many of them. I am never, ever doing that again. It is an unpleasant experience. The metal is thinner, something that you don't see in spec sheets, but the actual metal, I have dented some $50 cases from handling them because they use thinner metal. The glass is thinner. The glass is not always as pure because they use 2 or 4 millimeter thick glass, whereas some of the nicer cases use thicker glass. The fan quality, nicer cases generally tend to come with better fans, although I will admit Corsair kind of cheaped out by providing only 2 fans for $150. The fans in the Cooler Master are a better deal. And these are actually really, really silent. I don't have any problem using those fans. And you're talking to somebody here who loves Be Quiet Noctua fans as much as they cost because they are silent, reliable, and they last forever. But the overall quality of construction, the ports on the top, cable management in the back, how the power supply fits in, drive mounting options. And then one last point that nobody ever talks about unless they do a really detailed case review, screw quality. This is an odd one, but the quality of the screws in the back for how the panels attach, the quality of the motherboard mount screws, the quality of the drive tray screws in the back, it all adds up. If you're trying to build a $500 or a $750 build, I get it. I understand. $50 cases make sense at that level. If you're building a $1,000 to maybe $1,200 build, if you can stretch to a $100 case, it's worth it. If you've got $1,500 to $2,000 to spend, give your sanity and your build experience a boost by buying something decent, and do not buy those cheap $50 cases. They are $50 for a reason. Power supplies are an interesting topic. It used to be any old power supply was fine. I remember the days when 200 to 300 watt power supplies were all any computer needed, no matter how fancy your build. Those days are long over. Many of you who have not built a computer in 5 years are going to be shocked to hear this. If you can afford it, and you're building a PC that's $1,500 or over, and you want it to last 4+ years, and you want to be able to upgrade your graphics card, buy a 1,000 watt power supply. That probably sounds like a lot to some of you who maybe built a Ryzen 5 1600 or a Ryzen 7 2700X 5 or 6 years ago. But in 2022, going into 2023, it is no longer crazy. Your old computer with a 600 or 700 watt power supply is not the same thing that's required today if you want to be able to upgrade. Now, if you don't, well, then you don't need that. You can absolutely go with a 650 or 750 watt power supply or a very lovely 850 watt power supply if you're just going to put an RX 6700 XT or 6800 XT in or RTX 3070 or 3080 and you never plan to change it. But the 4080 and the 4090 don't technically require a 1000 watt power supply, but you're out of your mind if you don't put one in there. The new RX 7900 XTX, I'm not used to the XTX yet, I will get there, also should have a 1000 watt power supply. They don't require it, but you should. You do not want to run a power supply at 80% of its rated design for hours and hours and hours on end. You want to run it in the 50 to 60% range for a long time. Power supplies are one of the items I've had fail on me more than almost any other component. Power supplies and motherboards are the two things I've had more trouble with than anything else in my very long history of using computers. And one thing I've learned is that running power supplies at too high of a load for too long kills them more than anything else, except maybe for age. A 20-year-old power supply might die due to bad caps, but that's a completely different conversation. If you want to put a 5070 or a 5080 in 2 years when those come out, you want a 1000 watt power supply. And you also don't want less than an 80 plus gold at this point. The 80 plus bronzes do not cost less by enough to bother with. Get an 80 plus gold, get a fully modular, and get something, do your ears a favor, get something with a fluid dynamic bearing fan. You'll notice I've got 3 EVGAs on the desk here. There's a reason for that. I'm a big fan of EVGA. Now, there are other brands which are just fun as well. Superflower recently entered the United States market. They have been selling over the years for overseas for many years. This G3 from EVGA is a Superflower. They used to make power supplies for EVGA. Now they use other manufacturers. This G5 sitting here, very nice unit. I have a G5 on 2 of my test benches. I used to have other power supplies. When the 30 series came out and I put a RTX 3080 and then RTX 3090, I started having random shutdown problems. Those were 850 watt, 80 plus platinum, very highly rated power supplies, but they were 2 or 3 years old, and the way they delivered their power and, shall we say, their overall build wasn't quite what the 30 series needed at the top end. I replaced both of those power supplies with 2 of these. All those problems went away, and since then I've replaced all of the power supplies on my test machines with EVGAs, and they have been nothing but trouble-free. You may notice there's a 1300 watt power supply down here. Even a 4090 does not need a 1300 watt power supply. This is a bit overkill. The only reason you'd want to get a 1300 watt power supply like this is if you're going with a 4090 today and you're thinking, I'm going to go with a 5090 when those come out, and maybe a 6090. And I want a power supply that lasts longer than this build. I want to be able to replace my i9-13900K, and I want to have a power supply that lasts me for 10 years. If you want a 10-year power supply, if you look at the direction that power consumption has gone over the past 5 to 10 years, 1300 watts is not crazy. It's expensive, but you might not need to upgrade for a long time. Kind of like with many other components. Spend more, get more, and it lasts longer. Looking for a Windows 10 or 11 product key, but you don't want to spend $100 to $200 for it? Our sponsor, URCD Keys, provides discounted Windows keys at amazing prices. $15 for Windows 10 Professional, $21 for Windows 11 Professional, and just $60 for Microsoft Office 2021 Professional Plus. These product keys are the real deal. They activate directly with Microsoft Online, link to your Microsoft account, and they work forever. For Windows, you simply go to Settings, Update and Security, Activation, click Change Product Key, paste the key provided by URCD Keys, and in seconds, you're activated with Microsoft. For Office, go to setup.office.com, sign in with your Microsoft account, paste the product key provided by URCD Keys, and then download Office 2021 Pro Plus directly from Microsoft. Remember to use the discount code TD20 to save 25% off the already deeply discounted prices and support our channel at the same time. We have been using product keys from URCD Keys for almost 5 years now without any issues, and encourage you to do so as well. Thank you all so much for watching to the very end of this video. 2 gold stars for all of you still here. This was a long video. It was not scripted. I shared a lot of thoughts that I have pieced into other places between Twitter and our Discord when we had it, and in other videos and live streams in the past. I've considered doing breakout videos where I do an entire video just dedicated to single topics. Graphics card selection. I could go through the entire range of graphics cards and talk about who it's for, how long it'll last, what kind of PC it should go into, does it make sense for upgraders to put into an old CPU, what kind of power supply it requires. Let me know in the comment section below if you're interested in that. The big pile of SSDs, one of the conversations I was having with my lovely wife Rogue was, should I just go through that entire pile and talk about the history of SSDs and what computers they went in and when they were used and whether they're useful today? Most of those SSDs are either current or obsolete. There isn't a lot of, well, I guess there is gray area in between them. Let me know in the comments if you want that. I could do that for each of those topics and dive further in depth, but my concern is that it will feel like I'm just taking what was said here and just stretched out some. And if there is any of that you want to see in a specific video, let me know what topics. Do you want all of them? Do you just want SSDs? Do you just want RAM or graphics cards? Or do you want the whole thing? Cases would be hard to do. Cases are such a highly personal choice. A lot of that is aesthetics. Some of you like cases that I personally have zero interest in, and that is okay. If you don't like the 2 cases I had on the desk and you want something completely different, it is your computer. Personal computers are personal. You can build it however it pleases you. It's your money. You absolutely should not do what I say if it doesn't make you happy. That doesn't make any sense. Unless it comes to things like CPU and RAM and SSD selection, in which case you should listen to me. Because if I can be blunt, I've used more SSDs than about 500 of you combined. I do think it's important to point something out. 2022 is not 2016. We started our YouTube channel in 2016, and in 2016, AMD wasn't part of the conversation, and Intel was slow rolling 4-core chips after 4-core chips after 4-core chips. We did a lot of budget builds back then, $300, $400, $500 builds. We did used builds. We took Dell Optiplexes and we stuck in GTX 1070 Ti's and added some RAM and added some SSDs, which is where some of those SSDs came from, and then those machines got sold, which is why I don't have the SSDs anymore. And so that was a popular set of content that we did early in the channel. Lately, we've been talking about premium this and premium that, and many people have been saying, dude, I started watching your channel because you did those $350 builds. To which my reply would be, dude, the world moved on and $350 builds are stupid. I'm sorry. You don't have to like it. But not liking it doesn't change the reality. The world moved on, progress advanced, used computers and budget computers are now so far behind advanced computers, the gap has grown. Back then, you could put together an i5-2400 that was not as fast as a i7-7700K, but it wasn't that far behind. It absolutely positively would work, and it would work for a tiny fraction of the price. What are you going to do today? Put together an i5-7600K, 4 cores, 4 threads, an i5-8400, 6-core, 6-thread, locked at like 3 gigahertz? No. That's what you'd be doing if you built a used budget PC. There's Ryzen, of course. The Ryzen 5 1600 and the Ryzen 5 2600 were really interesting options in the day. The cool part is if you own one, drop a 5700X or a 5900X in there and boom, you've got an instant upgrade. None of you should be using a 1600 or 2600 today. And if you are, why? There's no need. The difference in performance between a 1600 and even a 5600X is night and day. Upgrade already. You have an AM4. You've got like a free gift of amazing performance boosts sitting in front of you. But if you are on an i5-8400, unfortunately you don't have a drop-in upgrade. the i9-9900K doesn't count. It costs too much. And so now you're looking at doing an entire platform swap, which is why some of you will do one of these Ryzens here because you want to be able to do a CPU upgrade in the future like AM4 did, which you can't do on Intel because these are LGA 1700 is dead. And now I'm talking too much, and so I'm going to go. But thank you all very much for watching. I appreciate you being here. Like, comment, subscribe, and do all the YouTube things. And to anybody who stayed through all of that, one more bonus gold star for you because you're awesome for sticking around. Watch time on YouTube matters. Thank you. I will see all of you in the DDR4 versus DDR5 comparison.